Casper was born at Worthing Hospital. For the first 12 hours of his life, we thought everything was absolutely fine. And then about 12 hours into his life, he was in respiratory distress.
Within about an hour, they had intubated him and were preparing an emergency transfer across from Worthing to Brighton to the intensive care unit on the neonatal ward there.
Which was quite a reality check, going from being on a maternity ward surrounded by obviously lots of other people with happy babies to a neonatal unit where everything is suddenly very technical, very precise, lots of other very sick babies, which is really hard to see. And then you're thrown into that situation within 24 hours of having your own son. We
were told at the time that they couldn't be sure what, if anything, if he would firstly survive, if they weren't sure what had happened to him. They didn't know if he'd stopped breathing for too long to recover.
Yeah, the doctor had a very honest conversation with us almost immediately after he was intubated, just telling us that they did not know what was going on and they did not know how this was going to play out. And obviously for any new parent that's incredibly tough to hear in those early days. After a few days of his life, they diagnosed him with having meningitis after a lumbar puncture, which again, one of the many tests that he had, which wasn't a pleasant experience for any of us. They believed that the impact on his respiratory drive was as a result of the meningitis, leading to him becoming encephalitic. His other primary issue was that he was hypotonic, so he was very floppy, showed no movement at all, lay there very still.
They effectively thought he was probably brain damaged to the point where he may not do that. We were told anything he did in the future would effectively be a bonus because they thought he had encephalitis.
Yeah, a conversation really stands out to me where we had with a doctor who was a great doctor at the time, but she did very much a couple of weeks into his life sit us down and say that they had no idea what milestones he was ever going to hit. And yeah, that's and that's incredibly hard. We were just going step by step, and I think we tried to be really optimistic in terms of just take each milestone at a time and see where that leads.
And at that time, literally the milestone was how many times he would be able to actually breathe each minute on his own without a ventilator. It was very much, normal babies are meant to breathe around 30 to 40 times a minute, possibly more. He was breathing sort of 12 to 14 times a minute. And yeah, like you say, we spent 4 weeks on an intensive care ward with him literally every day in and out. So after around 4 weeks, when he'd sort of grown out of the prenatal ward, we were actually moved to the Royal Alexandra Hospital in Brighton, which is a separate hospital very close by, where we settled on the HDU ward, and then we stayed for the next, in and out for the next 9 months, approximately after that.
Because we didn't know what was wrong with Casper for so long, the treatment he received turned out, in hindsight, that it was completely inappropriate for his condition. So he was on a thing called Optiflow, which delivers high quantities of oxygen to a child, but it doesn't deliver any pressure. So it kept him well enough, but it actually wasn't what you would use at all for a child with CCHS.
Yeah, so we still didn't have a diagnosis.
So we didn't have a diagnosis.
Months in.
I think that was really highlighted when we got to London, because actually we didn't...
Yeah, we were told by the specialist.
We didn't think anything of the facilities available to us at Brighton until we got to a London hospital, and suddenly you are confronted with every expert in every field, and about 5 of them with slightly differing specialities. So, which was great. So the first few days when we got to London with Casper, when we finally got a slot at the London hospital.
Yeah, so we'd waited to get to London. Again, the NHS is great, but it took us, a month? A month of waiting, of being referred to London to actually get into a London-based hospital.
So as soon as we got to London, actually we were very quickly presented with the idea that Casper's issues were not to do with a impact of meningitis
or brain damage.
He had previously had MRIs of his brain which had been reviewed by experts, which didn't show any damage to the brain that they could visibly see from an MRI. So they were confident enough that they didn't think that was a problem. So we met with the neurology team at Evelina, and they, from that moment, said this is not from the meningitis. We're not debating that he had meningitis, but this is not as a result of the meningitis. and he needs to be having full genetic screening because we think there's something else going on. They also did a number of other tests, including an EMG, which went to...
quite horrendous. So yes, that was one of the worst things we did, because it was effectively involved sticking needles through his chin, through his cheeks and through his forehead. And basically they would then judge what conduction the nerves made and if it was correct or not. But obviously severely painful for anyone, let alone a child. So that was probably one of the worst tests that we ended up doing over the course of the months we were there. We went down for the scan, pretty much like every other scan that we'd done.
Yeah, it seemed very routine.
Went in, the radiologist was scanning his diaphragm, and essentially he then suddenly stopped mid-scan and had a word with his colleague, came back a couple of minutes later and said that what they had found, which they didn't expect to find, it's not what they were looking for, was effectively a number of lumps and masses in his stomach, which on a very first impression they thought were likely to be cancerous tumours, which obviously was then suddenly like nothing at all to what we were expecting. Straight away, the Evelina referred us to Great Ormond Street Hospital, where any child under 1 with cancer goes in the UK.
So we arrived at Great Ormond Street, and actually even before we'd got there, as they had discovered the tumours at Evelina, they did... The first mention of the FOX2B gene was mentioned to us, because suddenly the picture of having the type of cancer that he was presenting with and a poor respiratory drive suddenly linked to the FOX2B gene and CCHS. And that was kind of the first time we'd ever heard about it.
Yeah, so basically the tumours, along with his respiratory issues, gave them a fuller picture at Great Ormond Street of what the condition might be, and it helped that by pure chance the next day the genetic screening results came back, which said that he did have CCHS, which is congenital central hypoventilation syndrome, and essentially that is very rare. There's around 100 to 150 children in the UK who have ever been diagnosed, around 2,000 in the whole world, and with that, he is the rarest of the rare in that his particular type of CCHS, he's an NPALM, and around 50% of CCHS children who are born as NPALM are also born with neuroblastoma or cancerous types of tumours, and unfortunately he was one of those. We've since been told by our consultant at GOSH, who has worked there for 30 to 40 years and leads the entire cancer team, that he's the most complex case of neuroblastoma they've ever seen in any child in his entire career. What we were told very simply is that effectively there is no cure. You will have artificial ventilation when Casper sleeps for the rest of his life.
Getting the diagnosis of CCHS, as we had seen him make such improvements when we thought he had a completely different problem, that was quite a hard-hitting moment, being told that yes, he now has this condition and there is no cure. The treatment is a ventilator, which he will be restricted to using for the rest of his life. And currently within the NHS, there is no further research happening. There's no further development in how to improve the treatment for him.
We requested a meeting with the geneticists at the London Evelina Hospital, and by chance there was a doctor called Alex Deng. We essentially ended up having a conversation around how do we take and create a treatment and a cure for something that doesn't exist. Alex was extremely good and proactive with us, which we massively appreciated. That's culminated in the setup of Keep Me Breathing, where we will be looking to solely develop and research treatments and cures for CCHS, and that will be the sole purpose of the charity.